Welcome to Folk Cries Rooted, a podcast interwoven with folk music, which explores the potential of climate action in our communities. I'm your host, Jemima Gleave, and I recorded this episode at the Landworkers Alliance Land Skills Fair in July. The Landworkers Alliance is a union of farmers, growers, foresters and land-based workers. Their mission is to improve the livelihood of their members and create a better food and land use system for everyone. They are a democratic, member-led union run by producers for producers. All their policies, representation and training comes from farmers, growers, foresters and land-based workers who have direct experience of the issues they work on. The governance of the organisation is driven by a democratically elected coordinating group that aims to represent a balance of sectors and regions. They are members of La Via Campesina, an international organisation of over 200 million peasants, farmers and agricultural workers around the world. They work with them to achieve a global vision of agroecology, food sovereignty and sustainable forestry. They work for a food and land use system that operates within the finite limits of our earth, regenerates natural resources and cools our planet without compromising the ability of others around the world or future generations to provide for themselves. They want to see power put back in the hands of producers and communities rather than supermarkets and industrial processors. They believe that producers, organisations and communities must be at the heart of decision making and have a strong voice in agricultural and forestry policy making. At the Land Skills Fair there was an abundance of ideas shared concerning ways that we can cultivate climate justice in our communities. I managed to capture some of these ideas in my interviews with a few lovely members of the Landworkers Alliance who gave talks at the Land Skills Fair. It just so happened that I only interviewed women. This wasn't planned, but it feels great to contribute to raising the voices of these powerful change makers. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Landworkers Alliance for hosting such an epic event, and to Elsie Harp, Molly Scott-Cato, Marina O'Connell and Sana Salazar for being such inspiring guests. It's Sunday morning at the Land Skills Fair and I'm sitting in a beautiful flower garden with Elsie Harp, who has just given a talk called Trauma, Polyvagal Theory and the Land. Elsie, welcome to Folkrise Rooted. Thank you for talking to me. Could you please explain a little bit about what the polyvagal theory is?
Sure. So it is a way to map reactions to distress and trauma via the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is a part of our autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for the fight, flight, freeze response inside the body. So polyvagal theory helps us to understand what happens when we're meeting those moments of stress. There are two aspects to it. There's the sympathetic nervous system and there's the parasympathetic nervous system. And so what can happen is that you go up on a curve from a space of what feels like social engagement. It's got the ventral vagal aspect of the nervous system. It's where we can respond to life stresses from a calm and collected place. And then we move up the ladder into the kind of fight or flight aspect of the nervous system, which is a sympathetic arm, and that's where we meet those edges of like fear, anxiousness, rapid heartbeat. The digestion kind of switches off. We lose our sense of being able to be nourished and hydrated. And then when we've met that edge, and if the trauma or the distress continues, we end up in the freeze response, which is where we end up feeling very disconnected from the world and disassociated. So polyvagal theory is essentially just a map to help us understand how to support our nervous system in moments of stress.
Okay, amazing, thank you. And during the talk you said that if you have been in prolonged states of freeze, that's when sort of chronic mental health conditions arise. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the kind of common modern ailment that we all encounter at some point in our lives is a sense of depression, and that's really where we kind of lack motivation. It has a lot to do with our gut-brain axis. So the vagus nerve comes from the most ancient part of our brain. It's the thalamus, the kind of lizard part of our brain, and touches all organs inside the body and helps to kind of regulate heartbeat, breathing, digestion, and goes down into the gut. And so 70% of our serotonin receptors are inside our gut and not inside our brain. And so chronically over time, if you're in this state of freeze and you've lost access to absorbing decent nutrients inside the body, you can develop kind of chronic mental health conditions. They're kind of biological and psychological kind of aspects to poor mental health. There's also a phenomenon that occurs that's called it's the AMPA receptors inside the brain, which is they're neurotransmitters inside the brain, and they're responsible for regulating our emotions, memory. And over time, if we're meeting moments of stress, the cortisol and adrenaline, those mobilizing hormones inside the body, which are responsible for helping us move through moments of danger, the cortisol and adrenaline kind of cement onto these AMPA receptors inside the brain, and so make it much, much more difficult to move back down the polyvagal ladder into a space of social engagement and calm and collectedness. So over time, the combination of what's happening inside the brain, what's happening inside the gut, and what's happening inside the nervous system can create chronic mental health conditions.
And how do you think engagement with the land and with nature can be used as a tool to move us into the parasympathetic nervous system state?
So that happens really naturally by being surrounded by green. They've done some really interesting studies where they attached what's called an ECG. It's like picks up kind of your heart rate, and they did a blindfolded study, which is a really interesting one. And so they got them to touch different surfaces. One surface I think was plastic, the other one was marble, and the other one was wood. And when people touch the wood, their heart rate drops. And so we know, because of how the vagus nerve acts, is that if our heartbeat is regulated, then we're in that calm, collected, social space. And they also did another one with flowers, which is my passion, which is just being able to look at an image of a flower. It doesn't even have to be the physical flower itself. Just looking at an image of flower will help us bring us into that parasympathetic state. And so obviously we also have the kind of in the microbiome of the soil supports the microbiome of the body, and because the serotonin receptors are inside our gut and not inside our brain, having contact with the soil and having contact with the earth and ingesting parts of that supports that gut-brain axis and supports mental health. So there's a myriad of different ways in which nature can support moving through that polyvagal ladder. I think the senses and sensory practices in nature can be really powerful and really important. We shared in the talk some really beautiful ones, which can be really simple, like walking barefoot on the soil or lying on the floor and looking up at the sky. I think observing patterns in nature and the fact that nature holds all aspects of life within it mean that it can be really easy to see ourselves reflected in nature. Once did a practice with a young person, which was if you could describe yourself as a weather pattern, what would you describe yourself as? Or we're out in nature, find something that mirrors your experience. And they picked up something and they were like, this is it, because it's alive and dead at the same time. And so being able to see ourselves reflected in nature helps us to feel held by something that's sort of more than ourselves, and it feels like we don't have to hold it all by ourselves, because nature's continuing its life cycles just as we are.
Right, so much wisdom there. Thank you. And you mentioned about experiencing nature as a caregiver. Our nervous system state is sort of developed from when we're a child to when we're an adult, and trauma can impact the state that our nervous system's in, and we should be getting cues of safety from our caregivers, and if we don't experience these, then we can exist in sort of chronic states of fight or flight or freeze. And you mentioned that actually we can take cues of safety from nature and experience nature as a caregiver. I thought that was so beautiful. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. And I think that really, for me, has come about through the use of my senses. So smell is a really beautiful one it's a beautiful sense to relate to, because it's so complex. And I think when we're smelling something, it goes through what's known as our olfactory system, which also accesses that kind of quite lizard part of the brain. And so it can help to soothe that guard dog that's constantly looking for cues of danger, and it allows a sense of safety to be developed using nature. I think also just observing the cycles of nature help us to feel kind of connected and not so mad.
Through bushes and through briars, I've lately made my way, all for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and play, all for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and play. I overheard a female, her voice it rang so clear, long time have I been waiting for the coming of my dear. Long time have I been waiting for the coming of my dear. Sometimes I am uneasy and troubled in my mind. Sometimes I think I'll go to my love and tell to him my mind. But if I should go to my love he would say nay. If I show to him my boldness, he'll ne'er love me again. If I show to him my boldness. He'll never love me again. Through bushes and through briars, I've lately made my way, all for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and to play.
Nature is constant, you know.
Yeah.
It's constantly giving us feedback, sensory feedback. And I work quite a lot with, or I previously worked quite a lot with young people in a city, and we've thought kind of long and hard about nature connection practices that can be done indoors if you don't have access to green spaces, and water is a really powerful one. And so just running cold water on the wrists activates the vagus nerve, so that can bring us into that sense of parasympathetic rest. Lighting a candle can be a really beautiful one, or candle watching. Opening a window was something that was shared earlier, and allowing fresh air to come into the space.
It's like connecting with the elements. What tools do you think nature connection practices can bring to climate activists, and do you have any insight about how we as a collective can face this crisis and stay well?
I think it's essential, and I'm going to use that word because of the enormity of the situation that we're facing. It's essential that we are resourced in the face of this ecological emergency. And so resourcing ourselves, it can be very straightforward using nature. I think we have to develop a familiarity with our various different feeling states to know when we have capacity to take on the work, but also really need deep rest. You know, like the land rests, we also really deeply need rest. And so I think my suggestion, and what I would really like to see within the movement, is people developing a familiarity with their nervous system and knowing how to use those mobilizing states with real intent. You know, we are born with the two aspects of a nervous system because we need both. We need sympathetic action. It's called fight or flight, but it's actually mobilizing energy and can be really invigorating if we know how to channel that well. But we also need the parasympathetic aspect. And what's happening is that people are ending up in this freeze response, which is their other arm. It's called the dorsal vagal state. And they're bottoming out because they're being faced with that level of intensity of the recognition that our mortality is on the line here means that we bottom out. And so understanding polyvagal theory, or understanding the nervous system, means that people will understand how to bring themselves back into a state of connectedness, of presence. And so I think it's an important body of work that is developing, and nature is there just to hold us through that. And I think when we develop that relationship with ourselves, then we can develop a really reciprocal relationship with nature.
Okay, thank you so much wisdom there. And if people would like to find out more about Elsie's work, her name online is Divina Botanica. Yeah, in the wind.
And noises.
So I'm with Molly Scott-Cato. Molly is a member of the Green Party and an activist and an economist. She wrote a book called Bioregional Economy, and I've just sat in for one of her talks. Molly was discussing land ownership, and one of the questions that she asked was, how would land ownership liberate us? I don't know if you could just maybe have a little talk about
But do you know what I
your
thought was
thoughts on
most
that?
interesting when people gave their answers to that question was that the people who weren't British knew exactly how land structure, land ownership and the history of land ownership worked in their country. So we got a perfect account of Israel and China.
Yeah.
None of the British people knew.
We didn't know. It was so true.
Isn't that very disempowering that we can't make claims on land, which is obviously fundamental to our livelihood, if we don't understand the history of how we've been dispossessed from land. So that's the first point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 1649 to St. George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, they defied the laws. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in peace, they said, to dig and sow. We come to work the land in common and to make the wasteland grow. This earth divided we will make whole, so it can be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do disdain. No man has any right to buy or sell the earth for private gain. By theft and murder they took the land. Now everywhere the wolves rise up at their command. We work, we eat together, we need no source. We will not bow to masters or pay rent to the lords. We are free, though we are poor. You diggers all stand up for glory, stand up now. From the men of property the order came. They sent their hired men and troopers to wipe out the diggers' claim, tear down their cottages, destroy their corn. They were dispersed, only the vision lingers on. You poor take courage, you rich take care. The earth was made a common treasury for everyone to share. All things in common, all people one. We come in peace, the order came to cut them down.
So what do you think that we can do as a community, as a society to
Let's also
re-educate
remember
ourselves?
that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. Which is that insight from Indigenous people, which
Yeah.
I think is so important as well. So we're not necessarily looking for private land ownership here, we're looking for access to the resource that we need. And some
Yeah.
people made that point, which I
Yeah.
think was a good point. But
Not
I think
a sort of economic extractive model, but just
Exactly.
taking what we need and giving back in return.
Exactly, but also no extraction of value from people that aren't working.
Yeah.
So rent. Why is there rent? How do you justify that? There is no justification for that. It's true of private houses as well as agricultural land.
Absolutely, yeah. There was a really interesting comment from a guy who was a grower who was saying that he's grown up as a grower, he's now working as a grower, and he can't see at all in his future the potential of him being able to afford land to grow on.
Exactly. So that's where we come back to the issue of why do the people that own the land now in this country, in the UK? And I think we have to start by looking back at the history there. So when you do that, firstly you find that, well, it really does start with 1066. You know, Saxon land ownership was different. The Normans pushed everybody off their land. They gave it to barons. We got into that habit of having large landed estates. And then over time, basically, the Crown owned a lot of land, the Church owned a lot of land, and if you did things that the King approved of, you got given some land.
Yeah.
I mean, that, it's not exactly a fair process of land distribution. But then, of course, we get to the enclosures as well, which I was talking about, which is the most recent example of this, which is when people, about a third of the land before enclosure, about a third of the land belonged to people in common. So we're talking about small peasant farmers now who had enough food to grow, enough land to grow their own food, gather firewood, and then they had some rights to graze their cattle on common land. And that made them independent. And so the process of enclosure created an urban working class, basically, and agricultural labourers, people who'd lost power and were now essentially wage slaves. And that's the process that we need to look at reversing.
We're in this position now where we're completely dispossessed from our land, and what do you think that we can do as a society to make steps towards creating justice in that system?
I think we should look at other countries where land ownership is much fairer than it is here, and where most countries have, this is what I've learned from teaching this over many years, most countries have a history of land reform, which means people looked at who owned the land and they divided it up differently, and they essentially owned, the people who then got to use the land without paying for it were the people who were using it for their own needs or for growing food for other people, rather than just for rental purposes. So that's a really important thing. But I think also, we need to organise to get that debated in Parliament. And I think we need to get a bill written that's about what a significant land reform would look like for the UK. Get that put down in Parliament. I do know people who would put it down in Parliament if we'd written it. And then wouldn't it be great to put that in the House of Lords, which is only there because the landowners are given power. The House of Lords is the landowners. We got two chambers. One is for the commoners like us, and then the landowners one is the House of Lords. And so whenever you try and change, that's why they got their enclosures, private acts of Parliament to drive people off land. Let's now put this bill down in the House of Lords and challenge the landowners to justify that they own our country and we don't.
Amazing. Thank you
You're
so
very
much.
welcome.
Avec ce chien过去的年龄，说若会过去不来弄弄那卡路内，哈斯西修的那男人的故事，可的这出了去我的好下来个。西的娃嘛，我也西的娃嘛，我也西的娃嘛，我是开的好那的个。西的娃嘛，我有外人的说的，一个是开的西故事，也我的好下来个。Masum do bolso, masum do bolso, masum do bolso, cai a rona de que. Passa na bolsa, dá na bolsa, tô cheiro roupa, que sou a gente de que. She do amor, she do amor, she do amor, she cai a rona de que. She do amor, eu era no joelho. E das horas digo, she é por isso já de que. Scarlet caboose, but to the body shop. Scarlet caboose, show them a short of the spoon in the house. Wow! She the one boy, she the one boy, she the one boy, she kind of fun. She the one boy, you're what it is, Lordy. And the scarlet jingle, she had body push out again. She the one boy, she the one boy, she kind of fun again. She the one boy, you're what it is, Lordy. And the scarlet jingle, she had body push out again.
I am sitting in the healing year at the Land Skills Fair with Anna Salazar, and we've just had a workshop about regenerative women on the land. Thank you so much for talking to me. Welcome to Folkrise Rooted. Could you please talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing?
Okay, sure.
Thank
So
you.
yes, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah.
So I'm a community horticulturist and also an indigenous farmer. So my work revolves around teaching children how to grow food, teaching them in schools and in learning institutions, nurseries. I've been doing that for about 12 years now, and that's been awesome in teaching our kids where the food comes from, because I remember when I first began teaching, I asked the class of about 30 pupils where food came from, and the answer astonished me. All of them responded that food comes from the fridge, from the cupboard, from the tin, from the packet, from the supermarket shelf. None of them replied that food comes from the earth.
Wow. Yeah.
12 years on, I asked the same question a couple of months ago to a different class of 30 pupils, and all of them said food comes from the plant. No, none whatsoever said food comes from the cupboard or whatever, which was really happy. I was really happy to hear, because I prompted them. I was like, "You sure food doesn't come from the tin?" It's like, "No, miss, what are you talking about? You sure it doesn't come from the supermarket?" "No, miss, it comes from the plants, you know."
Yeah.
So that was really cool. What else? I most recently began a project for Sisters of African Caribbean Heritage to learn to reconnect back to the land under 3 core subjects. One is land cultivation, the other one is food growing and enterprise. And the reason why I began this project was mainly because of myself. I think one of the sisters mentioned, quite a few of the sisters mentioned, that we are so willing and always giving out that we forget about the oneness within ourselves.
Yeah.
And anyone who works the land will tell you that working the land is like a never-ending job. Literally, you could be the first one there on the land to work and the last one there to leave at night, and you still have not finished. It just always keeps going.
Yeah.
So one forgets to look after themselves.
Yeah.
I think during the lockdown, or just after the lockdown, I found myself in a really traumatic situation where I needed to reconnect myself to my inner self, and I didn't know how to. So a little voice inside my head said, "Well, you need to connect yourself with the sisters." And I said, "Okay, that makes sense. So how do I do that?" And the little voice said, "Well, you teach them how to grow food, and in return they will give you the love and the nurturing and the knowledge that you need to heal yourself, so to speak, and to learn how to put yourself first before you give yourself out there." And so that's what I did, and it was actually Land Workers Alliance that allowed me to put that or created the space, should I say, for me to put that project together. And this is our 2nd year running, and it's going really, really well. We've just now acquired another plot, a community plot, where we want to open it up to more sisters from all cultures to come, so that we can create that ripple effect. The idea is that we reconnect all sisters, women, non-binary folks, back to the land, so that together we can tackle, I won't even say tackle because we're doing it, but so together we can co-create, and we can regenerate, and we can connect back to the lands. Like I said to you, for me, community means coming united together to make things happen.
Yeah.
Like that whole light effect. If you have many dots, but when you're looking for far, say, all those dots become one bright shine light.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's the way forward. I believe that the vision has been enough said, enough done, and I believe that we are all coming out, and I believe that each one of us will bring something to the table. We've had enough of all this separation, so we're doing what we can. We're going back to the land, we're growing our own food, we're teaching our children ancient knowledge that has been forgotten, we're teaching our children how to grow food, how to be self-sustainable. There's so much good works being done, and I think that this is a winner. I think we are doing it, and it's very important to recognise that we are doing it. It is being done.
It is being done, we're doing it, and we're capable of taking this enormous crisis in our hands and turning it into something beautiful and positive and liberating and connecting.
Gratitude is a must, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
welcome.
I'm so inspired by your energy and your positivity. It's so lovely.
Thank
I think
you.
we really need to hear positive voices in this movement, you know, of we can do this, we can lead ourselves out of this, and we're doing it, you know, it's being done.
Yes, and we're growing with love, yes.
Yeah.
And I really feel that. Yeah.
Thank
I think
you so
I've
much.
learned so much, to be honest with you. I didn't know what to expect when I came here.
Yeah,
And I'm
me
really
too.
happy that I did.
Yeah, me too.
This is just feeding me to see. And I haven't even been out there. So I'm looking forward to going
got
out there and
lots more
seeing
to
it.
see. So I'm sitting at the healing area of the Land Workers Alliance Festival with Marina O'Connell. Marina wrote a book called Designing Regenerative Food Systems, and she has been a sustainable agriculture lecturer and now teaches permaculture and biodynamics at the Apricot Centre in Dartington in South Devon. So thank you for joining me.
Hello.
Hello. Could you tell me a bit about what regenerative agriculture means?
Regenerative agriculture is a buzzword at the moment, and it's what's called an emergent system. But the definition I like is that it's about repairing the soil biome, so which is a little bit like the gut biome, but putting the bacteria and the fungi back into the soil. And when you do that, 5 of the cycles around soil and climate start to repair themselves. So it's like you're flipping the system out of a negative downward spiral into a positive repairing or regenerative spiral system. So once you've repaired the soil biome, what happens is the carbon cycle starts to work again. So carbon is sequestered or taken out of the air by the plants photosynthesizing. And the plants then leak sugars into the ground where it feeds the bacteria and the fungi. And those bacteria and fungi then die themselves and they become
organic matter, and that organic matter, those little bacteria and fungi also stick organic matter onto the mineral component of the soil, and that's called soil aggregates, and so that's how carbon is taken out of the air in the form of carbon dioxide and made into a solid form of carbon in the soil. So those microflora and fauna, they also are busy mining nutrients from the mineral aspect of the soil and feeding the plants. So the plants feed them and they feed the plants. So the nutrient cycle starts working again. So therefore you don't need to put chemical nutrients onto the ground, and it's those chemical nutrients like nitrate fertilizers that actually destroy the microflora and fauna and stop the soil from sequestering carbon. So we've got the carbon cycle is repaired, the nutrient cycle is repaired. The water cycle then starts working better because the organic matter in the soil works as a giant sponge. So when it rains, when you get heavy rainfall, it can absorb a lot more water, and then when it's dry, like it is at the moment, it can hang on to that water so the plants don't need watering so much. And then that helps cut down on flooding as well and soil erosion. So we've got the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle, the water cycle. Then what that does is it builds the biodiversity cycle from the ground up. So obviously things like worms and beetles eat all those bacteria and fungi, and then birds come along and eat worms, and then and voles come along and eat the worms, and then predatory birds come along and eat those, and butterflies will come along, and caterpillars will come along, and lizards come along. Everything turns up. And takes quite a long time to repair. But
how long would you say it takes to repair from eroded soil to a really thriving biodiverse ecosystem in the soil? And
so the soil can repair itself quite quickly in about 3 years, but the whole system takes 7 to 10 years to really sort itself out.
From eroded soil to when the predatory birds come in, and when you see them, you know, okay, this is a thriving system.
That's right.
Amazing.
Because you've got your top predator coming.
Yeah.
And then the final cycle that repairs itself is the human ecosystem. So the local economy then, normally the food from these systems is sold locally, so then the local economy starts working again and community starts building around these farms. So farmers go from being broke and, you know, being quite lonely quite often to these thriving hubs of community.
Amazing.
It's quite beautiful. And of course we eat food, and the food is nutrient dense. It's much better for us.
Yeah. Wow. It's a complete transformation just from starting with sort of focusing on the soil and the biodiversity of life within that soil.
Yeah.
So you use preparations to cultivate life in the soil?
So there are lots of different methods. So as a regenerative farmer, you can use lots of different methods. I call it a toolkit of methods.
Yeah.
So one method that I use biodynamic preparation. So that's like fermented cow manure. And the cow gut is absolutely full of bacteria and fungi, and you ferment it. And then you add that as a spray. So it's a bit like a kind of kimchi for the soil, if you like. But also you might use compost teas. There's a woman called Elaine Ingham who's done a huge amount of work on soil ecology in America. So you can basically get your compost heap and...
Like with comfrey...
so your compost heap is basically just a pile of bacteria. So then you get your compost heap and you put some of it in water, and you warm the water up and bubble air through it, and then that's compost tea, and you spread that on the ground. But then also putting wood chips on the ground, or cow manure in particular, will re-inoculate the soil with that biome. And then when you've done that, you then need to feed it with what I call green manures. So these are plants that you're putting fertility back into the soil with.
Like clover.
Clovers.
Yeah.
And then reducing compaction, so letting the air in. So because all of these little creatures breathe, it helps the soil come back to life.
Amazing. Wow, what a transformation. Okay, and there was something that you mentioned in your talk where you said that you've been approached by The Guardian recently because the price of nitrates, which are traditionally used in non-sustainable agricultural methods as a fertiliser, has sort of skyrocketed, and from £300
a tonne.
a tonne to £1,000 a tonne at the moment. So you're actually being approached for your insight into alternative and sustainable and cheaper methods.
Yeah. So a lot of industrial farmers would use nitrate fertiliser to grow their crops.
Mm-hmm.
But suddenly they can't afford them because of the Ukrainian crisis.
Yeah.
So the simplest way to put nitrates into your soil is to grow legumes or clovers. It's a particular group of plants, and they take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, and they turn it into nitrates into the ground. Also, if you have animals in your farm system, all of the cow manure and chicken manure is really high in nitrates. So you don't have to have nitrates in a packet. You can have it by using a different form of farming. Obviously, it's quite difficult to transition quickly. You need planning, and one of the downsides, I suppose you might say, but it's not really a downside, is that if you're growing, let's say, vegetables or cereals, let's say for 3 years, then you need to let the land rest for 1 or 2 years to put all the fertility back in it again. So some farmers would say that's not economically viable because you've reduced your yield because you have to give your land a rest for a year. But the thing is, you're not having to buy the nitrate fertiliser. So actually when you do your spreadsheets, it's more profitable because you've got less inputs.
Right.
But also, what's really key is by not putting the nitrates on the ground, you're allowing that soil biome to repair itself, and then that sorts out all of those problems. So it is completely economically viable to do it, and especially now with the cost of nitrates going so high.
Amazing.
What will we do when we have no money? All true lovers, what will we do then? Only hop through the town for a Hungary crown, and we'll yodel it over again. And what will we do if we marry a sailor? All true lovers, what will we do then? Only sail on his ships, and we'll play on his lips, and we'll yodel it over again. And what will we do if we marry a tinker? All true lovers, what will we do then? Only sell a tin can and walk on with me, man, and we'll yodel it over again. And what will we do if we have a young daughter? All true lovers, what will we do then? Only take her in hand and walk on with me, man, and we'll yodel it over again. So what will we do when we have no money? All true lovers, what will we do then? Only hop through the town for a Hungary crown, and we'll yodel it over again.
One more question that I have for you, which is a question that was raised during your talk by a member of the audience. And that question was, oh sorry, I actually have two questions for you.
Right.
But that question was, how can you start a growing project without any money?
Okay, so that's it's always a problem because the cost of land is so high.
Yeah.
That and obviously farming, what we're talking about here is growing or farming as a business.
Yeah.
The cost of land is so high that if you kind of ran a spreadsheet on it, it wouldn't. It quite often doesn't make sense because of the cost of the land.
Yeah.
So the farm I'm on has been bought by a land trust, and 150 people have bought shares in that farm as a way because they wanted to invest their money in something that would have a positive effect on biodiversity and climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So we pay rent on the farm, but the land trust, so in this case it's the Biodynamic Land Trust, but there's also the Soil Association Land Trust and the Ecological Land Co-op, buy land and they keep it in regenerative food production in perpetuity, and they have all of the legal structures and the capacity and the skills to know how to buy the land, how to legally put it into a trust, how to receive the money from these investors and shareholders. So with our particular land trust, those are withdrawable shares, so if people want their money back they can have that, but they don't get a dividend. Some models you get a dividend paid to you, but I think it's this idea, I think this is an expression, isn't it, that it takes a village to raise a child, so it takes a community to create a farm. If people are wanting to invest money in something that would, address climate change, food production and biodiversity, it's a really good investment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Would you say that would be sort of your main advice in terms of how society can address the climate crisis?
I think that's one way. I think it's such a huge crisis we're going to need multiple ways. So if everybody eats, and 30% of everybody's carbon budget is food.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to decarbonise your own food that you're eating, my suggestion would be to buy organic or biodynamic or regenerative or agroecological food.
Yeah.
To eat it seasonally.
Yeah.
And local. Mm-hmm. So no avocados from Peru.
Yeah.
Nothing wrapped in plastic. I think it should be something like 20 kilos a year, so not much meat.
Yeah.
And if you are going to eat meat, it should be grass-fed.
Grass-fed and organic.
Yeah, and organic. So obviously that's expensive food, and I don't want to sound like an exclusive middle class, buy this expensive food. So yes, it's expensive, but my experience is if you cut down on your meat and you cook from scratch, maybe form a buying cooperative, so that you're buying it maybe in bulk, so then you get a cheaper price. That it's actually not that more expensive than if you're buying more processed food like ready-made pizzas or stuff like that. And so where we live, we give our waste food to the local food bank. So even if you're on a low income, you can get fresh organic food in your food bank. But I would suggest that a change in the way in which you shop and cook and eat is one of the most radical things you could do.
It's really a powerful tool that we have in our hands. That's actually our buying habits.
That's right.
And yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that this critique does come up often in terms of being able to afford organic produce. But yeah, as you suggested, things like cooperatives where you band together and then buy bulk for cheaper of sort of dried goods, and then if you're supporting a local regenerative farm, the price of vegetables, as far as I can tell, isn't vastly different at all to the supermarket prices. And the lovely thing is that they taste amazing, they're really highly nutritious, but also that they're not wrapped in plastic. And it's just such a different experience of sort of also connecting with your local community in that way,
That's right. The whole thing is it's a different experience. So let's say you go to your farm shop or the farmer's market to buy that, it becomes a pleasurable experience rather than the horrible. So it is. So, if you're talking about organic carrots or non-organic carrots, for instance, the price difference might be £1. So, it's maybe buying one less coffee a week.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, so it's. I think if you make that switch, it's quite transformative as to, you know, slows down your shopping, slows down your cooking, slows down your eating. It makes it an experience, an enjoyable experience.
This is it. It's sort of a changing of our mindsets of, okay, maybe I can't actually have all of these things that I want. Maybe I have to let go of, like you said, that one coffee a week so that I can afford to support the climate, which is ultimately responsible for keeping us alive, like our environment.
Yeah.
You know, so it's sort of, I mean, a massive change in mindset in terms of what is actually possible for us to consume. One more question. Can you tell me a bit about the Reclaim the Grain project that you're working on?
Yeah. We took on this farm in Devon in 2015, and it's a little bit bigger than the farms. I'm a horticulturalist, so it's a little bit bigger than the farms I'm normally working on. So we decided to grow grain, cereal, and in particular I wanted to grow something called YQ wheat, which stands for yield and quality. So it's a wheat that was bred by Martin Wolf, who's a scientist based at Wakelins. Sadly he's passed now, but he bred using conventional breeding techniques. He outbred he calls it a population wheat, so it's very genetically diverse. And what that means is it's incredibly climate resilient, so it can just cope, because it's got all that genetic diversity in there, it can cope with whatever the weather throws at it.
Amazing.
And so I was very keen to grow that, so we grew that, but it's completely not economically viable because grain is a very industrialised process, so when we sold it we hardly covered our costs. So we got together with a local bakery and a larger farmer next door to us who also was growing grains, cereals, and we formed a micro company called Reclaim the Grain. So the idea is that we bought a mill from America, the new American stone mill. It's a very beautiful bit of machinery. It's quite small, and that sits in the bakery. So we grow. So John Perkin and Old Parsonage Farm grows about 40 tonnes of grain a year, and again using another variety called Cornavai. That's based on old-fashioned forms of wheat that he got out of a seed bank. Anyway, it's a long story, but they've got lovely names like April Bearded and Percival Bluecone and all this. You know. And then that goes to the mill, and it's milled, and then it gets made into bread, or we put it in bags and sell it as flour. And the reason we called it Reclaim the Grain is because what we're trying to do is relocalise and decommodify these highly industrial crops, and we're selling it fresh. So we can go to a supermarket or shop and buy coffee from we know it's come from Peru, from a particular estate, and what the name of the bean is. But if you want to go and buy a bag of flour, it might have come from Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, it might have come from Canada, you've no idea. So what we're doing is on our packets of flour, we say, this is YQ wheat, grown at Huxham's Cross Farm, it's biodynamic, it was milled on this day, and you better eat it. It's best eaten within the next 2 months. So this mill is stone, but it works at a cool temperature. So when it mills the flour is not damaged. It's not denatured by the heating and the rolling process that normally happens. So it comes intact with all of its vitamins and nutrients and enzymes.
Right, like cold pressed oil, but cold milled flour.
That's right. That's it. That's exactly it.
Okay.
So what you've got is not a dead product. You've got a living product that is really good for you.
Yeah.
And so it's a completely different concept of wheat, and then of course making bread with it is also challenging because you've got different types of flour from different soils and different gluten contents.
Yeah.
So and this is part of the whole movement across the whole of the UK. So we've got lovely WhatsApp groups with hundreds of people on them. Farmers are planting these kinds of wheats. There's lots and lots of them. And I don't know, there must be 20 or 30 of these mills in the country now,
Wow.
all over the UK,
Yeah.
supplying either on farms or in bakeries, supplying bakeries, sourdough bakeries, and they're making bread and cakes and pastries.
That's so
and things.
inspiring.
Yeah, it's
Do you-
really exciting.
Yeah, really, really amazing that that's sort of lifted off the ground and is so sort of
Yeah.
thriving now.
In the
with-
pandemic, our mill
Yeah.
arrived in that first lockdown, that April of the first lockdown.
Wow.
That was quite exciting.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and good luck with all your work.
Thank you very much.